In our first 3 tutorials, we learned how to do a cast on, we learned to knit, and we learned to purl. And this section of our sampler, this is a sample of stocking knit stitch. And that is where one row is knitted, and on the purl side you do a purl stitch. And this is referenced as stocking knit stitch. Now in this one we made a border around the edge of knitting the first 5 stitches on each side and knitting about 5 rows at the top and the bottom, knitting every row to give us this ridge. And that just helps it to lay down. If this was all stocking knit stitch without this border, it would want to roll up. And we can take that roll out by when we block it, but I just used it there for you to get a little more experience of knitting and purling in your first sampler. So now the next 2 samplers that we're going to make is putting together that knit and that purl. And we're going to start on this one next. This is knitting every other stitch and purling every other stitch, and that's actually called the seed stitch. You'll see that referenced in patterns, just like the stocking knit stitch. It will be called that sometimes in the actual pattern. And on this sampler that we will be doing after the seed stitch, this is a 2 by 2 rib, and this is where 2 stitches are knitted and then 2 are purled. And you recognize this because this often will be at the rib of a hat, the band of a hat, the cuff on a sleeve, or mittens. So this gets used a lot. So we're still just working with knit and purl. So let's go back to the seed stitch. You know how to cast on. If you need a refresher, go back to tutorial 1 and cast on 35 stitches. That just seems like a good number to work with. And the reason why I want you to do the seed stitch is it will really give your hands that practice of just knitting back and forth, knit, purl, knit, purl. Remember, we're doing this not just so you have the knowledge of what a seed stitch looks like, but you're really training your hand and getting your hand and your brain working together and getting the feel so that you feel comfortable holding your yarn, and that you're looking for consistency in your tension on your needle. So do a square. I haven't quite done a square simply because, look, I'm going to run out of yarn, and so I thought, well, okay. But I want you to do as close to a square as possible. The idea isn't to hurry and get through. The idea is you're training your brain. This is just like, working out for, I don't know, what, track or something. You just keep doing it till it becomes natural. So now we're going to actually, I'm going to knit and purl here. So you're going to knit where there was a purl. Now remember, the purl gives you this little bump, and the knit, it's a little smoother. You can see that. So that's the purl. This is the knit. So now I'm going to knit where there was a purl. So we're just going to do that all the way across. Get my yarn, my stitches up here so it's close to the end of my needle. And we're just going to start off knitting, and then we're going to go to the purl stitch. Well, I didn't do that one very well, did I? So my yarn wanted to split on me there, and part of it is because this yarn, actually, you can see how easy it wants to open up, and I'm working with a needle that's got quite a point on it. So it's kind of easy to get your yarn to split. Not what we really want to have done, so I just have to watch for that. So there's my purl bump, so I know I need to knit over that, was the row before. Below it is a knit stitch, so I'm going to purl on top of that. So we're just going to knit, purl, knit, purl, keeping your tension always the same, knit, purl, knit, purl. Now this yarn's a little tricky. It's really nice yarn. I actually bought it. I knitted a baby's hat out of it and was perfect for that. But to actually work with it, it is a little more tricky because you can just see how easy it opens up. And that's easy to get split when you put your needle in that stitch. It's easy just to get, you know, part of that stitch. So you just have to watch for that. So we're just going to continue to knit and purl all the way across. Remember, when you're knitting, your yarn is in the back. Here's your needle, so the yarn is back here for the knit. For the purl stitch, I bring it forward and I'm just kind of pushing that stitch through. You don't wrap the needle around it. You wrap for the knit stitch. Bring this yarn here to the front so it's between you and the needle. Pick up your stitch back here, coming from the back side, bringing your needle forward, and then I call it push that yarn through that opening. So knit, wraps around, purl, bring the needle to the yarn to the front of the needle, and push that stitch through. Remember to keep your tension here, but I'm not distorting my yarn stitches. Slide smoothly on the needle. And one thing I like to do is I like to not keep my knitting all bunched up here under our hand. For some reason, we have a tendency to want to do that. But if you continue to kind of let your work spread out over your needle, it helps keep the tension evened out. If you get it all bunched up, you can start getting your tension too tight. So in order to keep a looser tension, keeping your work not overstretched out, but just gently laying kind of how it would naturally want to lay under your right hand helps keep it from getting too tight. So we're almost down here to the end. Now remember, I know this is a knit stitch because the row before it was a purl. So we're just doing the opposite of what we did the previous row. And we're almost down here and we're going to go to a cast off. And remember, we're doing a seed stitch. Now, by knitting and purling every other row, look at it, it just really gives a nice edge to the outer edge of our work. That's kind of good to remember because sometime you might want to have a really nice finished edge, and you can look back at your sampler and think, when I knitted and purled every other row, it gave a nice finish. So you may want to adapt this to a pattern sometime for a, front edge of a sweater or something. Kind of fun to be able to start thinking of, like, how do I use this someplace else? Where would that help me in the future? I know we're not there yet, but okay, so now we're going to pretend like this is a square. Have to really use our imagination a bit, but I'm running out of yarn, so we're just going to pretend it's a square. But I encourage you, for the sake of giving your hand and brain the exercise, getting the feel for just holding the yarn and making the stitches, knit a full square. So we're casting off. Just a quick tutorial on how we did that, a refresher. We're going to knit that first stitch, and all of it is going to be knit cast off all the way across. I'm not going to knit one and purl one in the cast off. We're just going to do a straight cast off. So I knit the next stitch, go back up and pick up that first cast off stitch, and we're going to bring it over the top of the second stitch. Do that again. We're going to knit the next stitch on a left hand needle. We're going to go to that first cast off stitch, and we're going to put it over the top of the left hand stitch. Do it one more time. Knit the stitch on the left needle, take the first stitch on the right hand needle, and we're just going to bring it over the top or pull this one through, whichever makes sense to your brain when we say that. We're calling that slipping the right stitch over the top. That's a term you'll see used in knitting, slip stitch. So we didn't knit that stitch again, we actually slipped it. We knitted this one. Now we're going to slip this stitch over the top of this one. Just like that. Look back at your work. You want it to be laying pretty even, all the loops about the same, and when we get done, it will look very similar to our original cast on. So when we get across the top of that, that pretty much finishes our seed stitch sampler. So we'll just keep going here. Okay, so I have finished casting off down to my last 2 stitches. This is done just like before. We've slipped that right stitch over the top of the left. I'm actually going to, look at this, is how much yarn I had left. So that was pretty good timing. And I'm just going to pull that right straight through. And when I weave this in, it'll be done. So you could either pull your yarn through, or like I showed you in the last tutorial 3, you can knit one more stitch there and actually pull the yarn through that stitch. Either way works. This cannot unravel. So that is a pretty quick sample of seed stitch. Now in this tutorial, we're going to go back, and I talked to you about this ribbing, a 2x2 ribbing. So these are you will have learned 3 processes here: stocking knit, seed stitch, and ribbing. And these are going to be your 3 practice. I would encourage you to do several of these. And I whipped this one out pretty fast. I actually used a needle that is really too big for the yarn, in my opinion, and so I got kind of sloppy with it at times because I wanted to hurry up and get it off of here for you. This yarn, really, I've gone down a size. This is a size 3 needle actually, and this yarn is really, it's very soft. It's 100% alpaca, and it really likes the smaller needle better. It just, the stitches will look better and lay better. So now a 2x2 rib, how do we do that? So I have to put this around my little finger because this is very slippery yarn. So the seed stitch, remember we knitted a stitch, then we purl a stitch, knit a stitch, purl a stitch, and we did that all the way across. Now with the 2x2 rib, it's knit 2, purl 2, and this yarn is the kind that wants to split, so I'm having to really identify the yarn there so I get the full stitch and not any loop off of another stitch. So now I'm going to make sure my yarn is all down here where it needs to be, keeping my tension correct. So I'm going to knit 2. There's my knit 2. And now I'm going to purl 2. Remember, when we purl, our yarn is on our front side towards us. There's my purl 2. Have 4 stitches, knit 2, purl 2, and now I'm going to knit 2. Moved my yarn to the back side of my needle so I can do the knit, pull it to the, bring it to the front side so I can do 2 purl stitches, and I'm going to do that all the way across. So when you cast on for the 2x2 ribbing, you want an even number of stitches. I believe I cast on 36 stitches, but go 36 or 34. But give yourself enough to, have to work with. If you make it too narrow, you won't really get the practice of the rib and how it really responds. So do at least 34 stitches. Don't need to make it huge, but give yourself enough. We've been working with 35 for the other first square that we did. So just continue, knit 2, purl 2, and if you lay it down and you come back to your work and you think, oh, now what did I just do, a knit stitch or did I do purl stitch? Remember, you can look here to see where your 2 purls are. So here's 2 purls, here's 2 purls, 2 knit. This actually should have been another purl, and I did a knit. So let's go back and look at that, because that's going to happen to you, and you're going to think, oh, what did I just do? So there's my 2 knit, my 2 purl, 2 knit. See the 2 bumps? That's the 2 purl, 2 knit. There's 1 purl. I need 1 more purl. So I have a bump and a bump. 2 knit, and we're going to go all the way across that way. Okay, so I have done a knit 2, purl 2 all the way across, and now we're ready to turn our work and go back. Technically, this is the back side or the purl side, and right now that's not real important to even remember, because it's going to look the same on both sides. Both sides look the same, except for this side had a piece of lint on it. So you've got knit 2, where the knit 2 was on this side is purl 2. So both sides look the same. Now to start out on our second row, we're going to knit the first 2 stitches because those are knit stitches. I want the purl bump on this side back here. So we're going to knit the first 2. So I look at it, I see knit, I know I need to knit. This is ribbing, and I need to wrap my little finger because this yarn is slick. Okay. So there's my 2 knit stitches, there's our 2 purl bumps, and it's telling us for this rib we want to purl where it's a purl bump and knit where it's a knit stitch. So whichever side you're on doesn't make any difference. You're going to always knit where you see a knit stitch, and you're going to purl where you see a purl stitch. So just concentrate on all the things we've been talking about. Your hands are relaxed, you're breathing, you're keeping your tension consistent, your needles can slide easily back and forth, so your tension's not getting too tight, you're not distorting your yarn. You just didn't know there was so much to think about, did you, when you were knitting? But really, it's common sense. It will all just come naturally, and you won't even have to think about it. It will just happen. That's why I encourage you to do these sampler squares, because it's really training your brains and your hands and your fingers to just all work together. Now, because I have this yarn wrapped around my little finger down here, I have to expand my hand just a little bit every once in a while to give myself a little more yarn. And because it doesn't slide now as easily, right? Because I wrapped it twice to keep it from being too loose. So you have to find ways to compensate when you do need a little extra more yarn to work with. So you just kind of slide your hand out there a little at a time, and you don't have to drop your yarn completely or rewrap your hand every time. Sometimes you do, you just start doing it automatically, but you want to feel that yarn being able to slip through your fingers, just ever so gently. Okay, just about through here. Last 2 stitches are a purl. The starting of our rib, you should be able to really start to see now what that looks like. So purl bumps, here's where the knit is, purl the knit. So we're just going to keep doing that for, well, I don't know how many rows, I didn't count here, but if I were to stretch this out, see, it's not quite a square. So I was saving some yarn to do this second sampler for you. So I didn't do as big a square, but I encourage you to do the square, because you're training your hands, and you can make several of these so that you get used to doing it. So what am I doing? I'm going back like I did before, and I'm knitting where it's a knit stitch, and I'm purling where it's a purl stitch. An opposite of the seed stitch. Remember, the seed stitch we knitted when it was a purl stitch, and we purled when it was a knit stitch. Well, we're just doing the opposite here. We're knitting on the knit every row, every time, and we're purling on the purl. That's what gives us a rib, or in this case, a 2x2 rib. We could make a 1x1 rib, and maybe we will do that sampler before we get too far down the road. Or you can do it on your own after you do the 2x2. Just knit every other stitch and purl every other stitch, like what we're doing here, but we're doing 2 knits and 2 purls. Okay, we're just going to continue to go across here knitting every time we come to a knit stitch, and then we purl when we come to a purl, and we're purling 2, and then we go back to knitting 2. Purl 2, knit 2. And I don't even think about my yarn coming to the front side. I've done it for so long that it just automatically goes to the front or the back, depending. Now for the knit, we wanted this yarn here in the back. For the purl, we want it in the front, but it's just such a little movement of the hand to do that. It's not a big deal. And that's why the more you knit these samplers to get your hands trained, it'll start to happen automatically. That's why I'm not having you do a garment right up front, because you would be very, very frustrated. Even, like I said earlier on, if it was a big long scarf, can you imagine just doing the same thing for 4 feet long, or however long you wanted your scarf. So we're starting out a row again. It's a knit stitch. I know that because it's smooth. The purl bump is over here. So we're just going to go knit 2, purl 2 all the way across. We're just going to keep doing that. And I'm going to finish off this row and come right back to you. Okay, so I have finished that row, and you can really see the ribbing starting to appear, and as we get more length, you'll be far more obvious, and you can see the stretch that happens in a ribbing. Stretch it out, and you can see how that works for a hat band and all other kinds of applications. So now I'm going to show you another technique with cast off that's special to ribbing, to keep the ribbing kind of in continuity to the knit and the purl. Similar to what we did in the past, but a little bit different. So rather than me knitting another whole piece here, I want you to pretend that really this little piece that I've been working on is really, finished, a long piece. But rather than going ahead and knitting that, I'm just going to use this little sampler. Now don't you do it. You make yourself do the whole big piece, because this is all about you really getting comfortable with your gauge and holding the needle, holding the yarn. So we're going to start out, this was our knit stitches. We're going to start out like before in cast on. I'm going to knit that stitch. And this was a knit stitch here in the gauge, in the ribbing. So I'm going to knit that second one. And again, we're going to slip that first stitch over the second stitch. Now we're at the first set of purl stitches. I want my ribbing to be in the knit and purl method. So I'm going to, this was a purl stitch, I'm going to purl that stitch. And I'm going to just slip this first, like we did before, over that purl stitch. Here again, we have a purl stitch. So I'm going to purl that stitch. And we're going to slip the stitch like before. And my yarn has split on me. So I want to be careful that I get all of that stitch. Okay, so now our next stitch is a knit stitch. So I'm going to knit that stitch and again slip that stitch over the knit. Knit again, slip, and now we're back to a purl stitch. So I'm going to purl that stitch and slip. Why are we doing that? It just helps maintain the integrity of our ribbing up here. We could just do a straight knit every stitch, and it would tend to kind of stretch it out, not let the integrity of the ribbing maintain itself. So finish that up. I'm going to be working on the next tutorial. We actually are going to step it up and start putting some other combinations in our samplers. So very, very important to get your attention and be ready for the next set of tutorials, which will be, we'll learn some slip stitches, how to increase and how to decrease, and how to make a pattern in your knitting while doing that. So get this down, do several of them, really work on it till you like what you see. Change up the yarn, change up the needle if you want to, and start seeing what different yarns and different needle sizes, how that affects your work. And have fun with that, and watch for the next tutorial, which actually will be tutorial 5, I think. So I'm having fun with this. I hope you are too. I hope you're learning some new techniques, and maybe just maybe you've never knitted before. Have fun, make comments. I'd love to hear from you. Bye now.